You know, I never thought that I would be one of those boring motherfuckers who said something like back in my day. But back in my day, a bop was simply a song that you really enjoyed listening to. Traveling by Utada Hikaru, that's a bop. Neurotic by TVXQ, that's a bop. Spellbound by Susie and the Banshees, that is a timeless bop. But apparently, bop has taken on a different meaning these days. It stands apparently for blown out, insert term for a woman's genitalia here. And I didn't personally know that until I heard about the Bop House, the world's very first OnlyFans creator house. The Bop House was started by an OnlyFans model named Sophie Rain, who recently came into my feed because she made a lot of money on OnlyFans and also just happens to look like she might be underage. The Bop House is full of similarly young-looking girls, and they all produce OnlyFans content and live with each other. They use platforms like TikTok and Instagram to create content for the platform that in some ways advertises their OnlyFans. And this content has actually gotten them quite a following. They've got a large following on Instagram and a large following on TikTok. And since the creation of the Bop House, there have been many other similar houses that have popped up. I found out the other day that there is a Top House, which is full of OnlyFans creators who are gay men who all swear that they're all tops, and I take their word for it. And another group of creators started the Alt Bop House, which is essentially the Bop House with a tattooed and edgy makeover. And because of the Alt Bop House, there has been a lot of conversation on social media about whether or not these women are reinforcing the fetishization of alternative women, and whether or not the Bop House at large is responsible for normalizing abusive behaviors towards young girls. And as a goth who did sex work when she was 19 years old, I wanted to come and share some of my perspective and also shed some light on what I feel like are some misunderstandings about sex work and the so-called alternative subculture. But as per usual, I am getting ahead of myself. Hi, my name is katblaque, and I like to think that I make content for introspective hot people. And if you're here, I'll assume that's you. And if you're brand new here, you know exactly what to do if this video pleases you. Click my button and join us right here on my channel. In 2019, a group of influencers created the Hype House, a content house of creators that made content with each other and used each other's large platforms to cross-promote their brand. And this content house was wildly popular. I remember when it was still the thing, and people really wanted to be part of it. It was a really, really big deal. There were popular influencers like Charlie and Dixie D'Amelio who were part of it. And it was just, for a lot of people, the goal. The goal for a lot of younger people was living in a content creator house and becoming a content creator. I mean, these kids, and I really do mean kids, were living in this lavish, beautiful Spanish-style mansion. They were making content with each other. And for a lot of younger kids, especially who grew up idolizing YouTubers, it was like Candyland. The Hype House was definitely not the first content house, but it was one of the most popular among Gen Z, and it certainly did go on to inspire other similar content homes. And you know, I've been a YouTuber for 20 years, right? And it is so fascinating to me how YouTube has shifted and changed over my lifetime. You know, I no longer get invited to VidCon as a featured creator, so it's been a while since I've been to that convention, but one of the things that stood out to me so much when I would go is that most of the people there are very young. I mean, you've got a lot of teenagers in the audience of your presentations that desperately want to be YouTubers. And it is kind of interesting to me because I started YouTube as a teenager. I started a YouTube channel at 15. 20 years later, here we are, and YouTube is my full-time job, but I didn't really ever think that it would be. So it's so interesting to meet young people whose aspiration is to be a content creator online, because I remember that for a really long time, it didn't really feel like it would be a viable job. And to this day, there are still plenty of people who struggle to understand that it is a viable job. As someone who got into stuff when I was younger, I am definitely very concerned about how much easier it is for perverts to access children, because they got to me, and that was back when it was a little bit harder to do so. These days, kids are incentivized to upload images of themselves. A lot of kids act like they're always on camera or they always have a captive audience. And that has been a very interesting thing to observe, because it has changed, I think, the way that a lot of teenagers develop. A lot of teenagers no longer allow themselves to have their like cringy, weird self-expression phase, because everything is so curated and posted and seen. And you know what I mean? Like, there's just so much that you can no longer keep to yourself because of how normalized it is to post everything to social media. Children are impressionable. And for that reason, I am very concerned about what they see on the internet. That's also one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this particular video, because there are some very concerning things that I wanted to talk about that are related to the Bop House. Sophie Rain first came into my feed when a story about her was posted about how she earned $43 million in her first year of being on OnlyFans. And this was notable because Sophie Rain looks very young. And a lot of the women that I follow who speak out about sexism had a lot to say about that. Because I think if you've ever been a young girl, you have an awareness of like how much men like want sex from you and how much men are wanting to pressure you. And when you see someone like Sophie Rain, who I think for a lot of people does indeed look underage, it causes you to really think about it. It causes you to really think about the ethics of this content and the safety of these girls, honestly. Sophie Rain's success highlights the well-established pattern of men wanting to gain access to images of very young girls. And for that reason, a lot of especially older women were concerned, very concerned for what this means for these women and what this says about these men. With her earnings, Sophie Rain opened up the Bop House and had 7 other girls move in with her. And all of these girls, similar to the Hype House, live together, create content with each other, and use each other's platforms to cross-promote their brand. However, it was their way of cross-promoting that actually caused quite a bit of controversy. One of the things that the Bop House does is hold open auditions. It is a way to get a lot of people making videos and feeding into a trend and maybe even potentially find people for the house. I don't know if they're very serious about these open auditions. I think it's just kind of like a trend that they do. But naturally, I will say, the open auditions for the Bop House have included some girls who were underage. One of those girls is named Piper Rockelle. Piper Rockelle has been on YouTube and in the media from a very, very young age. Initially using YouTube as a platform to promote her singing and dancing, she uploads content now that is a little bit more lifestyle oriented and has a long career as a 17-year-old of creating content online. If you go to Piper Rockelle's Instagram page, if you are like me, you will probably start to feel very uncomfortable because a lot of the photos that she posts are pictures of her in very tight clothing, photographed in a way that I've frankly only seen OnlyFans models photograph themselves, if you get what I'm trying to say. And it is concerning to me. It is very, very concerning to me. But this wouldn't actually be that surprising to you if you were familiar with Piper Rockelle's history, and especially her mother and the previous content house that she used to live in called The Squad. Piper, along with a lot of other teenage creators, came together to create The Squad, a content creation home that, again, would be used to create content with each other and use each other's platforms to cross-promote each other's brands. And the house was actually pretty popular, but it would all come crumbling down after some former members accused Tiffany Smith, who is Piper's mother, of inappropriate behavior. Apparently, Piper's mom would regularly tell the female members of the house to wear tighter and and more revealing clothing, often trying to take pictures of them wearing bikinis. She would also make a series of very inappropriate comments to the male members of the house, and obviously, these are all teenagers who haven't really thought about a lot of that stuff, and it made them really uncomfortable. Ultimately, the squad would close down in 2022, and they would go their separate ways. But in 2025, Tiffany Smith still manages Piper Rockelle's Brand Army page. Brand Army is essentially OnlyFans. It is a platform that allows for followers of a certain creator to pay for exclusive access to pictures and videos through a small subscription fee. I saw some videos from some other content creators who were able to get into the Brand Army account, and from the comments that you can see underneath the pictures, it is pretty apparent that her audience is not predominantly teenagers. Surprise, surprise, it's predominantly grown men. And as of now, Piper Rockelle is the top requested person to join the Bop House. And the Bop House did not help when apparently they ran into Piper Rockelle while out at the mall and decided to create collaboration content with her. They uploaded a video welcoming her into the Bop House as a 17-year-old, and as you can imagine, that upset a lot of people. Apparently, while they were out one day, they ran into Piper at the mall and decided to go back to the Bop House and film some collaboration content purely for TikTok. And when they were trying to welcome her into the Bop House, really they were welcoming her into the physical home, not necessarily sex work. I watched a couple of videos of some of the women in the Bop House talking about this, and when you watch these videos, you really do get the impression that these girls are still forming their frontal lobe. These are girls who are making some rash decisions that for us as older people may seem obviously not right, but to them, totally reasonable, totally rational. And of course, that brings into question whether or not these young women are truly aware of what they're doing in terms of its long-term impact. And in a lot of people's opinion, the collaboration content that they made with Piper Rockelle is a great example of how sex work is being glamorized to young women. And many people have said that the members of the Bop House are in some way grooming Piper Rockelle into sex work. And when I think about all of this, it is almost impossible for me not to think of Danielle Bregoli, aka Bhad Bhabie, aka the Cash Me Outside girl. Now, I did not remember how young she was when she went on to the Dr. Phil show, but she made her first appearance on Dr. Phil when she was just 13 years old. Now, I hope that people understand this, especially after Dr. Phil's recent actions, but Dr. Phil is like conservative propaganda. Right? Danielle Bregoli was on Dr. Phil to be a spectacle, a representation of the out-of-control teen who's been negatively influenced by the streets and by social media. Her title card read, let me actually get this correct, accused by mother of stealing cars and framing her for a false drug charge. That is what she was on the show to discuss. And her mother stood out because even though they have a lot of similarities, her mother is very clearly, like an Italian white woman, right? But Danielle Bregoli, let's just say, I hear my people, I do not see them. She had dropped out of school, was running the streets and committing crimes. And she was constantly at odds with her mother. I mean, the episode was mostly clips of them yelling at each other. Danielle would be sent off to a wilderness camp, and if you are familiar with her story, you know that she did not have a fully positive experience at that wilderness camp. Her episode of Dr. Phil was incredibly successful, and after appearing on the show, she would gain quite a bit of popularity and infamy. Cash Me Outside became a slogan that people started to put on t-shirts, and slowly but surely, Danielle's mother started to kind of change her attitude towards her daughter. Suddenly, Danielle was out here getting endorsement deals and starting to make music, and she became, in so many ways, Danielle's manager. Danielle Bregoli's episode was one of Dr. Phil's most successful episodes, and she would actually say that to him in his face on stage. Danielle Bregoli would actually make an OnlyFans account the week after she turned 18, and she broke the record on OnlyFans for earnings, making $1 million in only 6 hours. By the end of 2021, she made upwards of $50 million on her barely legal OnlyFans. And this was before Sophie Rain, and I think it would be kind of silly to say that there weren't some people who probably didn't get at least a little bit of inspiration from that. And with the pandemic, a lot of people turned to sex work as their regular normative jobs dried up or became obsolete. The success of these barely legal OnlyFans models has started a debate about whether or not these women are in some way reinforcing the abuse that young girls experience. And a related debate is being had about the Bop House and whether or not their existence reinforces the fetishism of alternative women. Now, I'm going to start this section of this video out by saying that I do think that the Bop House does deserve criticism. I think that some of the things that they have done are definitely worth talking about. I really wanted to make this video because of the Bop House, because I kept getting videos in my feed about the Bop House, and it's been really interesting to observe this discourse, I'll just say.
The Bop House has got to be the most disgusting thing I've ever seen.
I've been seeing a lot of discourse on the Bop House lately, and I'm so happy we're talking about it because it's a perfect example of how this internet perversion of alternative culture ties into sexual violence. There were so many encounters where I was hooking up with a guy for the first time and they just assumed, they just did it without asking me. And I stopped and I was like, why the fuck would you think I like that? And they were like, oh, I don't know, like your tattoos, like your piercings, I don't know.
You bitches are quite literally the prime example of why the alt community gets fetishized in general.
So as I said earlier, I classify myself as a goth, and I do that because I am part of the goth subculture and I love goth music. And that is the space that I predominantly socialize in. I think it's interesting because people are having a conversation online about the commodification of alternative subculture. But really what's kind of interesting to me about that is alternative subcultures are all kind of being ushered into this category of like goth and punk, which are more politically forward movements. When people have conversations about how you can't be a conservative and a goth, I think that makes a lot of sense because goth is not a conservative movement. Goth has its roots in punk, right? So it doesn't really make sense to be reinforcing or supporting the status quo and also calling yourself goth or punk. But there's a lot of other alternative subcultures that you can be part of where that is not really the expectation. Maybe this is an age thing, I don't really know, but it's been interesting to me to listen to people talk about the commodification of alternative subculture, and they're just talking about alternative subcultures as if they are all goth. To me, it doesn't really make sense to see them all as one thing. You know, metalheads are not goth, right? Like, I mean, some people go between both, right? But metalheads are a very different group of people, right? Like, again, some people are in both, but it's a very different group of people, right? There's a lot of alternative subcultures. Not all of them are goth, not all of them are punk. And it seems kind of interesting to me that the reality of the scene is not really acknowledged. Goth spaces are havens for misfits, for people who are different, for people who are queer, for people who are sex workers, for people who would be turned away at other places but can come here and be strange and weird. I've talked about this before, but one of the reasons why some goth clubs have a dress code is because they want to make sure that everyone who comes to this club was actually meaning to come to this club, isn't just coming to the club to look at people who are weird as spectacles. They want to make sure that if you're in the space, you're actually participating in the space. You're not just sort of here as a tourist. And what's fascinating to me about this conversation about commodification is there's a lot of people on social media who think that being goth is about buying the right clothes and shopping at the right places. And it has become this thing to debate whether or not somebody looks goth. I mean, one of the criticisms that the Bop House was receiving is that these girls don't look alternative, because the criticism they have is that these girls look like e-girls and therefore aren't a true and accurate representation of alternative culture, right?
You bitches are e-girls at most. You have tattoos and then you put on big ass eyeliner and call it alt. Bitch, what the fuck?
If you look at the Bop House and you look at those women and you're like, oh yeah, those are alt girls. you probably were only introduced to alternative subculture through social media like 2020, 2019 TikTok.
And it's funny because I go to the page and I look at these girls and I'm like, they look fucking alternative to me, man. Even if you compare them with the girls of the Bop House, which is very clearly catering to a young, youthful, fresh-faced, natural beauty kind of thing, they are alternative, especially in comparison to them. And the thing that's also funny to me is that when goth culture is commodified, a lot of the stuff that you're going to see being sold is just like BDSM stuff, Go to like Lip Service right now. Lip Service, one of the most popular places for goths to get clothes and such. You're going to see lots of BDSM stuff. In fact, within the Los Angeles BDSM scene, the goth and BDSM community have often intersected, with a lot of goth clubs being one of the only places where some of the most well-known BDSM players could go and play. There were clubs like Cinematic, Dungeon, Perversion, Bizarre, Deviate, and Discipline that were all central places for BDSM players to go and perform. While BDSM in the goth clubs these days is fairly tame, it used to be a lot more hardcore. Well, before goth became a bit more mainstream and the clubs were a bit more filled with mixed company. The reason why that is associated with alternative culture is because of how BDSM and sex work has had such a huge presence within alternative culture.
Sexual energy at Covenant 13 is kind of a gray area. There's guys and girls, and sometimes you can't really tell their sexuality or their sex right away.
Almost everybody here, I can guarantee you, is bisexual.
Sexuality has always been black and white, male and female, but the goth scene has always pushed some parameters between sexuality.
I mean, think of it this way, right? Kink and BDSM are things that are highly stigmatized in our society. So part of why it was like subversive for someone to walk their boyfriend across campus was that it wasn't something that was socially acceptable. It was an expression of, depending on the positions, people traversing or, going against what they are told they should be, right? And so it is a way of expression that is in so many ways quite political. It's interesting to me that so many people think that being alternative is being sex worker exclusionary. I don't really get that at all. To me, that's not very alternative. It sounds like you are agreeing with the conservatives, actually. And it's been kind of interesting to watch these videos with young women wearing collars who are completely opposed to BDSM and goth and sexuality existing within the context of the alternative subculture. Now, I will say that there is something to be said about how some of these spaces are curated for the tourist, because one of the funny things living in LA that you sort of experience is that there's a difference between a goth event and like a goth event. Do you know what I mean? Like the club that I go to, people who live in LA are going to be able to figure this out, but I'm not going to be specific. The most well-known goth event is on a Saturday night. And if you have ever been to a goth club or a BDSM dungeon, because it's also a BDSM night, we'll get to that in a minute, it's not really either of these things. I mean, the music that they spin isn't really goth, and the BDSM is very tame, and it's really hard to actually do it because it's a really crowded club on a Saturday night. Like, I hate how crowded it gets on Saturday nights. A few times I've gone. But growing up, I wanted to run away to this club so bad. I dreamed of leaving my little San Gabriel Valley town and coming down to Hollywood to go to the club. Like, it was such an exciting thing for me for so long. And then when I got there, it was after I'd already been to the BDSM dungeons and after I'd already been to the goth club. And it just wasn't enough of either, if I'm being frank. But the thing that is different between the Saturday, which is like their most well-known event, and the Wednesday when I go, is that there are strippers and there's, like I said, a BDSM area. And they are very clearly catering to people who aren't really necessarily goth, but want to go to like a goth club and dance with dark music and see beautiful women on the stage, right? If you are someone who truly likes goth music, you're not going to really enjoy Saturday unless you have like a social circle that you like to see there, or you've been going for a really long time and you just really, really like to see your people there. Wednesday night, the difference is the dress code's a little bit more strict. It's completely free. And there are no dancers. There is none of that. And I do think that when it comes to talking about the way that the goth community has been commodified, it does sort of bring up the fact that a lot of times they will hire these women to be performers for the event who aren't necessarily part of the subculture, aren't particularly into the subculture, but are there in order to encourage men to spend money, right? And there is something to be said, and I want to make a point of this, there is something to be said about how that trend within the goth community specifically does sort of cultivate a group of like sex pests who come to the club assuming that all of the women in the club are sex workers who are willing to be their big tittied goth girlfriend, right? That is a thing. That is a problem, right? However, I do feel the need to point out that even if that is a problem, sex work and sex workers have always had a presence within the alternative subculture. Goth and BDSM weren't always so linked together, but it's true that sex workers have always had a presence within the alternative subculture. Why? Because they work alternative jobs. And actually, I will say that some of the events I go to, one of the very few places where sex workers can really do some of their art, if I'm being frank. It's one of those things where I think it's rude to assume that a goth girl is kinky. But I also think that if you were to go to a goth club, there is for sure a higher percentage of gothy, kinky people there than any other space, right? So it's really an issue of assumptions. I have had people proposition me in goth clubs and definitely assume that I was a sex worker based on our environment. So that is an issue, but I find it kind of maddening that so many people believed and argued that it was averse to alternative principles for sex workers to be alternative and also do sex work. Returning to the subject of overconsumption as a way that many people define their relationship to alternative subcultures, one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a lot of people online who see their purchase of demonias as like a rite of passage. I wonder if I have mine anywhere near me. Let me see if I can find them. These are my very first pair of demonia boots. I do not wear them, which is why they look so brand fucking new. I am definitely more of a Doc Martens girl. But if you've ever tried to purchase demonias, you know that they are, or should know, that they are an offshoot of Pleasers. Pleasers is a brand that almost exclusively makes shoes for strippers, I'll just say. Strippers and people who perform on the stage. And if you've purchased any Pleasers before, you know that they don't tend to last really long because really these are shoes that are meant for performers, right? Stage performers and sex workers, right? They're shoes that have crazy fantasy designs that are really designed to sell a fantasy. In fact, let me see what they're selling right now. I'm actually really curious. Like when you just Google Pleasers, like the first shoe you're going to see, that's a stripper heel. That is a stripper heel. You know, and the thing is, you go to their website and all of these shoes, a lot of them are silly. A lot of them are impractical, but they are there to sell a fantasy. They're there. Oh my God, stop. I don't want to buy anything. I can't walk in these shoes. They're there to sell a fantasy. They're there to sort of create an image that is, ooh, these are cute. Wait a minute though. These are cute. These are really cute. What the hell? Maybe I will buy some shoes. No, I'm not going to buy some shoes. I can't walk in these. It's impossible for me to walk in these. Oh, and they come in different black and red though. See, like who's wearing that? Realistically, who's wearing that? They're shoes that are really meant to perform in more than anything. Shoes for stand on stage or laying on your back, honestly. And, going to their website, I feel like that's not as clear as it used to be, but it is a very well-known thing. They make shoes for strippers, right? And it's funny to me that so many people don't know that they are patronizing a brand that was kind of created for sex workers. Pleasers have been the preferred shoe of sex workers for quite some time because of how good they are at selling a fantasy. And what I think most people don't seem to be registering when it comes to either of these houses is that these girls are selling a fantasy. These girls are not trying to sell to most of the people who are criticizing them. They're not trying to market themselves to alternative teenagers who really care about all the principles of alternative subcultures. They are trying to market themselves to men who think that they like alternative women. And I say that because one thing that you definitely know if you are an alternative woman is that a lot of men who say they like goth girls are not really into goth girls. They're into what they think a goth girl is, not the reality of it. So it's not really that surprising to me that some of you would look at the alt Bop House, see these girls looking the way that they do, and not catch that. Because in all reality, they're not really trying to sell necessarily a true depiction of a goth woman or a true depiction of an alternative woman. They are just trying to sell to men who kind of like girls who are a little edgy. The reality of a goth woman would probably not be of interest to them. The point that I really wanted to make in this video is that what most of you guys are reacting to is the fact that sex work is no longer in the underground. And I think that some of the criticisms people are making are very valid. Lots of real reasons to be concerned, especially after hearing Piper Rockelle's story and especially after seeing what the Bop House has sort of done to continue that legacy, right? But most of you are really reacting to the fact that these sex workers are using platforms like TikTok and Instagram to promote themselves. And ironically, the only reason that these women are on TikTok and Instagram is because FOSTA SESTA made it so that these women really didn't have other platforms to promote themselves. FOSTA SESTA laws are all about policing how people solicit sex on the internet. They're laws that are supposed to go into effect during this administration, and they're supposed to curb human trafficking. FOSTA SESTA makes it so that the sex workers who have relied on the internet to advertise their services no longer really have the proper avenues to do that. But what they effectively do is take the power out of the hands of sex workers and places it into the hands of pimps and porn producers. They also limit the free speech and expression of sex workers online. So now it has become a bit more common for these sex workers to use apps like TikTok and Instagram to innocuously promote their OnlyFans accounts. I think a lot of people can look at what's happening to sex workers and be dismissive of it because they think that it's never going to really affect them because they're not sex workers. But what I think they don't get is that a lot of these sort of laws, they're going to impact more than just sex workers. And a lot of people turn a blind eye to sex workers and their advocacy and ultimately end up paying for it in the long run because it happened to sex workers first. Sex workers are often one of the very first groups that people go after. So if it happens to sex workers, there is a very high likelihood that it will happen to other groups of people. It's also important to note that FOSTA SESTA laws also impact sex education and LGBT content online. To me, the issue is very obviously less so about the fact that some of these young women are groomed into sex work and more so the fact that you can't ignore the young women who do sex work. It's about how so many people would prefer sex workers to simply be underground. They don't want to have to interact with or humanize sex workers. They just want to dismiss them as immoral and relegate them to the shadows. I understand why many people may see conversations with and about sex workers to be inappropriate. I really, really do. I understand why so many people think that these conversations are regressive. But I really feel the need to point out that the reason why sex workers have more visibility and the reason why you're even having these conversations is because the conditions for sex workers have improved. What frustrates me about this conversation is that most of you don't really have a sense of how the industry has changed. The big difference between now and then is that the girls who live in the Bop House all own their content. They own it all. They're not going through these hoops that would actually harm them so much more. I am a former sex worker, and I wanted to share what it was like for me doing sex work in 2009. So in 2009, I was in college. I was in one of my first years of college, and my parents had stopped financially supporting me, and I had started my medical transition. And I needed money. I needed resources. I needed to pay for books. And it was really hard for me to find a job back then because there were no legal protections for transgender people. So at the time, I was a young woman existing in the way that I do, and there were always men who wanted to give me money for things. At 19, I would say, not very well adjusted. I had been through sexual violence, and I was in the height of my hypersexuality phase where I was trying desperately to feel in control of some negative experiences that I had. And so I started going to these parties, these sex parties. And at one of these sex parties, I was scouted by a porn producer. Now, back in the day, if you wanted to upload video, if you wanted to broadcast webcam, if you wanted to do what these OnlyFans models are doing right now, you really only could do it through a porn company. Basically, these companies were able to create the distribution. They had the access to all of these resources and all of the ways to sell what you were producing. Naturally, many men, many abusive people used that as a way to trap women who were already in vulnerable situations into an even more vulnerable one. And keeping these women underpaid, keeping these women in a perpetual cycle where they're desperate and they need resources and they turn to, these porn producers in order to get money, all of that was intentional. And in the olden days, that's kind of how it worked. If you wanted anything, you needed to go through someone else who was generally taking a lot of your money. Now, I was a cam girl. I was approached by a porn company that at the time they had a full service porn studio. Then they also had their webcam portal. And then they also had a strip joint that they ran, I guess, a couple of their performers through. And I knew a girl that used to work in the club. And I saw how much, posters of her would be posted all over social media. And I said, I don't really want that. I don't really want my photos posted all over social media. This is a great example of the time we were in. And so I decided to be a cam girl. I took them up on that offer because it was one of the only offers that was given to me at the time. And I absolutely hated it. I absolutely hated it. And one of the biggest reasons I hated it was because I had to sell the fantasy. Sex work is really all about selling a fantasy. And I wish that more people understood that, because the criticism of these girls as not being authentic, that's probably intentional, because at least from what I did as a sex worker, right? You really couldn't be yourself. You really couldn't be yourself. You had to be someone else, at least for me, right? So in my body shape and type, right, I can't actually be a true reflection of my sexual person, right? My sexual person is submissive. She is not dom in any way and can't do, let's just say, many of the things that those gals on Shemale Yum do. And that's not gonna fly. It wasn't gonna fly because of the type of body I have, frankly, right? Because of the type of body I have, if I was gonna sell myself, I needed to embody this dominant, domineering Black trans woman who was very much a top, had no problems being pushy and dominant. And that just isn't me. It wasn't me. And a lot of people, when they would come to my room, expected that from me. And I had to kind of process that these men wanted something from me that was the complete opposite of who I was. And I think sex work, it's one of those lines of work that requires a lot more mental strength than I think most people are able to really understand, because most people who are successful at it, they have a way of compartmentalizing what they're doing that allows them to have certain experiences that don't imprint on them the same way. Yes, a lot of sex workers are traumatized and have tried to kind of, take that trauma and turn it into something else. And I do think that that's worth talking about. I also think it is important to point out that for a lot of people, the work part of sex work is really all about them selling that fantasy. And some people get really excited about it. For me, the thing that was really exhausting is that when you are trying to do sex work, you really can't stay the same person. You've got to change your hair up. You got to change your body up. Some people will make entire bits of content around the recent surgery that they had, right? A lot of people are incentivized to shift in order to maintain interest from their audience. And frankly, that was a bit much for me. It was a bit much for me personally to go through during a time in my life where I was sorting myself out, right? Like I wasn't really ready to be someone else. I was trying desperately to be myself, but I only had but so many options. This was one of the ones that was given to me and I took it. And I'm glad that it's not a thing I do anymore, to be frank. Interestingly enough, during the course of me writing this video, I had a man proposition me. I wrote all about it on my blog, blackandthecity.com. You guys can read more about that. I will put the blog post in the comment section. I will pin it and everything. I won't get into too much detail, but I had a guy who we had a whole conversation all night about what I did and how successful I was and what I had and this and this and that. And by the end of the night, the guy propositioned me and said that he was willing to pay basically for my entire life if I was willing to do certain sexual favors for him. And at a different time in my life, maybe that would have been seductive to me, because especially living in LA, he was like, I want to pay all of your rent. Girl, pay my rent, please. I'm thankful that my sugar daddies are my Patreon audience now, because you guys care about me a lot more. And that's the thing, when you are in a situation where one of your few options is sex work, you often have to kind of accept and have too much of a close view of how little people respect you, how dehumanized you are in someone's mind. And he wanted to do something with me every single day. And he was like, look, if you do this every single day, I will pay for your everything. And, whether it was tolerable to me or not, a man demanding every single day from me is kind of insane. And it would keep me in a situation where even if I have another life and things that I'm doing, I was perpetually in relation with this guy, right? And I'm so thankful that I'm not in a situation where that would be truly seductive. But I did think about it for a little bit. And this guy, as we were having this conversation, it was pretty clear that he was kind of an abusive dude, right? And that's the reality that a lot of people experience when they do sex work in this way. There are people who really rely on being able to privately abuse women who will never be listened to in public. And I've experienced enough sexual violence through my life to feel pretty confident about that at this point, that there were many men who assaulted me, who visited me with violence, who were relying on my ability to not be seen as a faithful narrator. Because in the before times, these girls would likely be in a situation where they had to be abused before they even got in front of a camera. Like, that's just the reality, right? And it is frustrating to me because I understand why some people are put off by the Bop House and their social media presence and the way that they've been able to rise and be a topic of conversation. I get that. But you guys are really not aware of the fact that it's very recent when sex workers have been able to make all of their money without going through a pimp, without going through a producer, and also come to social media, come to any source of media and speak and be listened to. That is a relatively new occurrence. And really, a lot of this conversation is happening because they did that, right? No one would know how much money Sophie Rain or Danielle Bregoli made if they didn't come and share their earnings, right? And what's funny is I think people always get this impression that sex workers need to be destitute. They need to be in a situation of desperation. That's one of the main arguments people are making right now. These girls don't seem that hard off. Why are they doing sex work and feeding into a system that normalizes the abuse of women? But the reality is, the industry for a lot of women has gotten better because they don't need to be abused before they do what they need to do to make money, right? And as I said, there are people within those industries that do those abuses who do rely on these women being perpetually poor, perpetually desperate. It creates a perfect scenario for getting someone to agree to do something they don't want to do, right? When this guy propositioned me, I didn't want to do that shit. I didn't want to do that at all, what he wanted for me to do, right? But if I was in a more desperate situation, my morals would be a little bit more wish-washy, right? And what's kind of been interesting to me about a lot of this conversation too, is when I look at my life and I look at my relationship to men, I definitely noticed a change in the way that men interacted with me when I finally became financially independent and I no longer needed men for anything. Because my perception is that there was a certain point in my life when I was much younger and I had very little resources where men were eager to be in relationships with me because they knew that their money gave them power over me. And when I moved to Los Angeles, it was a really big deal for me to provide for myself and pay my own way, because I didn't want anyone to feel like I owed them something, because my experience with men was if they did something for me, I needed to give them sex. And frankly, that was something that I had to recognize was not reasonable, because my relationships with men were very much like that for a really long time. It took me a really long time to recognize that I didn't need to have sex with men. I'll never forget when I first moved to LA and I started like paying for my own shit, there would be men that I would go out with who were very obviously turned off by it. Very obviously turned off by the fact that I can make my own money and I don't really like need them. That I'm actually electing to do this. I'm not doing this out of desperation. And what's kind of ironic is you have so many people who criticize OnlyFans models and especially criticize them for making a lot of money and not needing a man. And there's this red pillion anger around the OnlyFans model being a woman who doesn't need a man. And really what I know this actually is a lot of men who are frustrated with the fact that they can't trap and triangulate women into doing things they don't want to do anymore. And I think that's worth talking about here, because why do you want these sex workers to be destitute? Why? Why? Why do you want sex work to be something that's only done out of desperation? Why does it bother you that someone who comes from a nice home or has resources would elect to do sex work? Why? Why? I saw a video where this girl was like, you can work a more dignified job. And it made me giggle, because how are we defining that? Sure, sex work isn't dignifying if you're someone who sees it as degrading. Sure. But you could argue that working for a company for most of your life that barely pays you enough to feed yourself every month, that relies on your paycheck to paycheck experience to continue to keep you there, that is willing to discard you the moment that your body degrades or you fall out of line or you become obsolete. I think that's pretty degrading. I think it's pretty degrading that some people will work their entire lives and never see $1 million. I think it's degrading that capitalism has tricked many of us into seeing sex work and the amount of money people make from sex work as not valuable, but has seen endlessly selling yourself into servitude as dignified. It's interesting to me that so many people have been convinced under capitalism that the position where we get screwed the most is actually the more dignified one. Who benefits from that? Who benefits from that if not the capitalists who are relying on you seeing getting paid as something you shouldn't be doing, right? Because that is kind of the argument a lot of people are making with all of this, that sex workers shouldn't be able to make money or make a lot of money. And they especially shouldn't be able to advertise, and they especially shouldn't be able to be paid for their labor because it's not really labor, right? You know, what's interesting to me about sex work being criticized is that really what it is a person in many ways allowing themselves to be exploited in some way. And there are people who can understand that in the context of sex work, but not in the context of the other job that they may work that is still exploitative, but seen as more normal and more dignified. And I think that we need to hone this conversation back, because most of the criticisms you guys have for the Bop House, most, not all, but most, it's really a criticism of capitalism.
This app has created this watered down, palatable version of alternative that is enjoyable and manageable to men and thus can be fetishized. And that's very dangerous to other women. I keep my natural hair color. I've consciously chosen to not present that way because to me, it is not enjoyable. It is dangerous. And I hate that. I hate that. And it's y'all's fault.
I know we've all heard people be like, oh yeah, SW is really empowering and you're taking your life back and using your body to make money. Why do all these girls look so young? I fucking hate the Bop House. It's a stupid fucking trend. And I hope these people learn, without getting hurt, that SW is a horrible industry that will chew you up and spit you out a broken and bitter person.
It is so much easier to blame sex workers instead of blaming the system that they're in, that incentivizes young women to sell themselves in order to gain a lot of money in a short period of time. I think that what some people are frustrated with is the fact that these young girls are able to make a lot of money in a short period of time, and most people can't. Most people can't. And why are we in a situation where a mom would feed her child to an audience of grown men? Why are we in a situation where Sophie Rain would start a content creation home full of younger looking girls that sell sex, right? Money, capitalism, right? This pressure that we're constantly under to earn, to be participating in the system, that is what creates this scenario that we're in. You have to wonder if Piper Rockelle's mom would be doing that if money was not something that they were trying to get, right? Would Piper Rockelle's mother give her child up so eagerly? Would Danielle Bergoli's mother come onto the show at first wanting to protect her 13-year-old daughter who is being overexposed and getting into crime and trouble, and then change her tone once she started making money? Probably not. Probably not. What's interesting to me is we talk about this content reaching teenagers or even younger, and how that would encourage them to admire sex work or to aspire to doing sex work. But I guess I don't really get that because I didn't grow up feeling that way. Sex work is something I ended up doing, But I didn't grow up idolizing sex workers. It's just something that ended up happening to me. And of course, things were a bit different then. But really, the reason I got into sex work and the reason that that guy scouted me is because of money. They saw me at 19 and they said, we can make some money from her, you know? And when I left, it was a little bit of a fight. And I'm kind of thankful now that there's no evidence of me doing it. But it was a moment of time in my life that I only really entertained because I needed money and because I wasn't able to make money and because I needed money in order to pay for the things that I absolutely needed in order to be alive. You know, it is a little ironic to me that so many people think that the proper response to all of this, to all of their concerns, is to reinforce shame against sex workers. Because ultimately, the reason why sex workers are often abused, the reason why sex workers often don't go to the cops and try to get help with what's happening to them is because people view sex work as so shameful that they view sex workers as people who can't experience violence and abuse or somehow brought it on themselves by their participation in the sex industry. And all shame does is provide cover for their abusers. The people who abuse sex workers are relying on a culture that does not see them as faithful narrators. They're relying on a culture that shames sex workers and does not see sex work as a viable career. And I respect that it's not something you would like for your daughter to do. I get that. I really do. But it's still labor. It's still work. And these women deserve protection, not shame. It's been kind of disturbing for me to see so many people rightfully criticize Bop House, but then usher in their own sort of swerfy logic into why we should not be creating safer environments for sex workers. It has always been easier to punish sex workers than it has been to punish the people who patronize them and the culture that reinforces their patronage. Sex work has existed forever. I think that people think that by taking these things away, it'll no longer exist. I think it's easy for people to look at these sex workers and point their finger, much in the way that you would point out what a girl is wearing after she's been assaulted, and say, isn't there something that you could do to prevent this from happening? Because that's a lot easier to say than it is to actually undo patriarchy and all of these things that make it so that these things happen. It is so much easier to point at a precise person and say, you are responsible for this, right? But no matter how many women dress modestly, no matter how many OnlyFans models get kicked off of the internet, men will always sexualize and abuse women. They never needed OnlyFans models to do that. I mean, men will sexualize and abuse a lizard. I don't know if you guys saw that story, but a group of men gang raped a lizard. I'm not joking. This idea that if these women just didn't do these things, it would make it so much easier for everyone else. It's a tempting idea, but it's not really an idea based in reality. I think, again, that it's very, 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 very necessary to criticize the Bop House and the things that they've interacted with. I think that Piper Rockelle's mother deserves a lot of criticism in this. I also think that some of you need to recognize that it's been very recent that we've been able to see and hear from sex workers. Sophie Rain herself came out and said that young women should not quit their day job for sex work. And the reality is that OnlyFans models do not make as much as Danielle Bregoli and Sophie Rain did on average. It's not something that they're really able to do. Most people make just above minimum wage, and that's the reality of it. The reality of it is most people who get into sex work are not going to be that successful. And a lot of OnlyFans creators who are successful have come out and said that. Please feel free to criticize the trend of young women in porn and the way that that is one of the largest areas that people who buy porn patronize. But I also think that it's worth pointing out that that is marketing, and these girls aren't going to be able to just come and be themselves and get paid for just being themselves. That's the dream. Wouldn't you love that? Wouldn't you love it if you didn't have to perform to survive under capitalism? Wouldn't you love it? Wouldn't that be nice? It's just not the reality. It's just not the reality. Knowing what we know of Disney and Nickelodeon stars and the way that they were abused, it's not totally shocking to me that Tiffany Smith would try to encourage her young daughter to wear tighter clothing and to otherwise sexualize herself so that she could be marketed in a certain way. It is a formula that works, and it's one that has been very successful in our society that objectifies women. I think in this new social media era, there were a lot of people who became bloggers and became content creators and did so because they wanted to be entertainers and realized pretty quickly that that was never going to happen for them. And I think for some people, because they've already created this pattern of constantly uploading pictures and videos that are paid for in some way, it may be a natural evolution to choose sex work over the vanilla entertainment industry where sex work is still quite present. Piper Rockelle's social media as it stands right now doesn't show much of her acting or singing at all. It mostly shows pictures and videos of her exhibiting her body. So it wouldn't shock me if when she does turn 18, she pulls a Danielle Bergoli and releases an OnlyFans that will become just as successful. I definitely don't think that it is a good idea to get into sex work the moment you turn 18. I really do think that it's one of those things that you really do need to think about. And I think that it's easy to get into it quickly and have a bad experience, especially when you are still figuring yourself out as an adult. I really do. None of that really, I think, dismisses the viability of an 18 or 19-year-old doing sex work. It's just something I wish I could go back and tell myself a bit more. Because personally, because my experience with sex work was so negative, it really messed up my sexuality a lot. Like, when you become used to selling your body, it becomes hard to not do that. It becomes hard to justify certain connections with people because you think, I mean, how much would this actually end up being? And it took me a really long time to pull out of my sex worker haze and stop performing and to start being present. It took me a long time to open my eyes when I was being intimate and actually enjoy what was happening, right? It also took me a long time to accept that I could enjoy what was happening because I didn't think for a really long time that that was part of it, right? And I think for that reason, I am hesitant to encourage people who have just become of legal age to jump into sex work. I think that right now the industry is a lot better than it used to be. I think that is great. I also think that another big difference between what the industry was when I was in it versus now is that I was fortunate enough to get out of the webcam game before it became pretty commonplace for people to record your performances. People are trying to justify criminalizing sex work, and I really feel the need to tell you that if your concern is you want to protect these women and girls by getting these sex workers off of these platforms, that's actually not going to protect them. It's actually just going to put them back into the hands of porn producers and pimps. As we have this conversation, men in our government are gearing up to make everyone who is not a man a second-class citizen. Banning porn, making it impossible for sex workers to advertise is part of the plan. It is, I'll say, likely where we will end up. Maybe I'll be wrong about that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But I really wanted to make this video because I think a lot of people don't quite have the right understanding of sex workers. And if you are a sex worker and you have something to say, please leave a comment underneath my video, because I know from my own experience that it has improved for sex workers. There are still lots of abuses, lots of things to criticize. Like I said, I think the Bop House deserves criticism. I think that Piper Rockelle's mother is... I won't say that in this video. But what I will say is that most people are reacting to the fact that sex work isn't as underground as it once was. And when it was as underground as it once was, it was rife with abuse and men that relied on these women being destitute in order to continue to abuse them. More people need to be aware of the fact that sex work is work, sex work is labor. And we shouldn't really be trying to make arguments that certain labor doesn't deserve to be paid. Those arguments really only help capitalists. Those arguments really only help abusive rich men who don't want to give anyone money. Personally, I am happy that sex workers are finally getting their share, that they're actually getting paid what they deserve, that pimps are not pocketing millions of dollars and giving them $100, because that's what the industry was for a really long time. And I'm glad it's changed, and I hope it keeps changing. Anyway, on that note, that is what I had to say about the Bop House and the alt Bop House and all of the various things connected to that. I'm very curious to know what you guys have to say about this. Also, before I go, a huge shout out to my new Patreon members. The last 3 who have joined my Patreon are Ben, Julia, and James Gaiman. Thank you so much for supporting me over there on Patreon. It means an awful lot. And I am trying my best to upload more content to Patreon. I've been making like friends only videos on TikTok for my TikTok mutuals to have like discourse and conversation. I think I'm going to start uploading those videos to my $10 mark. I have some vlogs and things that should be uploaded by the time that you guys see this video. I have a lot of things to talk about. And yeah, join me over on Patreon. It's a fun time. As per usual, I want you to always remember and to never forget that you are beautiful and you are loved. Bye.